but to summarize, we're looking at an emerging domain that's birthing new tools for transformation by bringing together psychedelics and technology into single offerings for humanity. So we've got a little bit of a different format for this one. We've got 4 speakers, almost like a panel format, and I'll be asking them questions, but also Meet PS is going to be open for you guys, so we'll also be taking from Q&A and dishing it out to the panelists too. So without further ado, Team Technodelic, please say hello when I say your name, so we know who we're going to be looking at for the next 40 minutes or so. So Money, give us a wee hi. Got you. So Money is head of business development of Trip, a new startup that's focused on creating mood-altering experiences in virtual reality. And it's really starting to take the transformative technology world by storm. And we've also got Carl H. Smith.
Hi there, how are you doing?
Hey, Carl. So Carl is my fellow Brit. He's the co-founder of the Cyberdelics Society. He's the director of Learning and Technology Centre and a principal research fellow at Ravensbourne University. He has 16 years experience conducting R&D into the application of hybrid technologies for perceptual and cognitive transformation. And we also have Heather.
Hello.
Heather Hargraves. So Heather, you may have seen her do a deep dive a little earlier on. She's a neurofeedback and a neuromeditation consultant and therapist, and her research interests includes the neurological underpinnings of various states of consciousness, including meditation, psychedelics, and she's also an advocate for this interface of neurofeedback modalities with psychedelic therapies. And last, but certainly not least, Mr. Robin Arnott. Robin?
Hello.
Okay. Why am I not surprised you have a background like that, Robin? Yeah. So Robin is CEO and co-founder of Andromeda Entertainment, which is one of the real pioneers of this technodelic space. And he's been in the consciousness hacking community for a number of years. And he's quite literally just written the manifesto, or a manifesto, on technodelics. So welcome to all of our speakers. And we'll kick off. And this is an open-ended question, but when I say the word technodelic, what does that mean to you?
You're asking that to everyone? Oh, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback.
That's a general question, yeah.
I could answer that because I have a very specific answer.
Mm-hmm.
These are technologies. You know, I'm going to get more specific because I think these are a derivative of games, though they don't have to be, but these are technologies that create a feedback loop with the player or with the user that shifts their state of consciousness, much the way a psychedelic does. So there's a quote that I use all the time from Terence McKenna. In 1990, he said, "The computers of the future will be drugs. The drugs of the future will be computers." I think we're beginning to scratch the surface of that, and that's technodelics.
So I'd chip in on that. I would say that actually it's any external stimulation that actually creates an altered state of consciousness. How we measure those altered states of consciousness is an issue. But I think technodelics are ancient, and you could argue all art is technodelic. And I'm really interested in the Annalisa meditations in the mornings because for me, you know, taking us from thinkers to awareness of the thinker is a move from content to context. And I believe that is also producing an incredible an altered state of consciousness. So it's like Jamie Will says, you know we can program consciousness, but what are we going to do with that?
So Money, it would be good for you to just give an insight into what Trip is and how that's working in this space of technodelics. A little bit more context on Trip.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Robin, thank you for, I think, your definition and the other one as well. I mean, I think as we look at this arena, you know, with respect to a digidelic, I think what's super exciting is there's a variety of modalities. I think there's a grounding certainly in in gaming and behavior and the risk reward kind of component. But I think it is certainly, from a technology standpoint, more expansive. Trip, I think what we're most pumped about is the early feedback and data that we're seeing around a pathway to becoming a new type of self-regulation system, right? And I love, you know, how Mikey opened up the last conversation about thinking and thought. And, you know, where that goes for me is to the default mode network. And at the end of the day, this emphasis on self-reflection and metacognition. And I do think Technodelics, Digidelics have this opportunity to really seize in on that, you know, independently, and, you know, enable us to hit upon what I think the psychedelic community is very familiar with respect to the MEQ30, right? So when you look at, you know, noetic quality, external unity.
Can you define what that means, Mani, the NEQ30?
Yeah, so the NEQ30 is a questionnaire used, I think, you know, predominantly in the psychedelic community to be able to describe and articulate your experience coming from a psychedelic journey. And I think where we are, you know, today, you know, even with respect to Trip is, you know, there are certain categories that we're already seeing some really, really positive lift with respect to that are contained in this survey, so to speak. And I would say positive mood shifts. I would say this idea of when we think about time and space, VR has this really unique, you know, propagation characteristic of actually compressing time. And, you know, a lot of data has kind of been coming out to support that. So I think right there, even in our early stages, we're seeing some really good parallels and analogs. So to me, you know, I think the near term, there's an opportunity to operate alongside, you know, psychedelics in a clinical sense, from a, you know, a precursor or pre-work and then a post integration perspective. I think, again, what's really exciting about where we are with Trip is we're you know, dual tracking around an offering that's broadly appealing for the masses, right? So if you think about what Peloton's done, we're sort of an analog around inner fitness. And then there's a clinical pathway, and we're starting down with addiction recovery, but we'd love to be able to apply the platform in areas like PTSD and severe depression that we're now finding use of psychedelics is extremely powerful for. And so I think there's a tandem approach, and then there's, you know, an independence that can come from Technodelics as we grow.
So just so the tandem approach, I know, Heather, that's something that you've really looked at, this stacking and then this curiosity of stacking things like neurofeedback with psychedelic therapies. Can you speak to some of that, especially with regards to your own research?
Yeah, my experience with the idea of technodelics, and I think because I come at this from a clinical window, is that these offer us a state of remembering. You know, it's a state of coming back to what you already know, but maybe never developed a relationship with because you were maybe never taught. And so my understanding of, you know, how I've come to work with taking research from psychedelics and then developing a neurofeedback protocol and then applying that with the client, I started to understand what is it that the psychedelic is offering that client as far as what is it helping them to remember. So when I'm augmenting the default mode network, which is the one I focused on the most, I learned that it helped people to remember to observe. So the ability to modulate your DMN, and we know the DMN is tied to the thalamus, which is tied to the relay station between the mind and the body. It's also tied to the cingulate, which mediates, you know, our lower centers and our emotional centers and our cognitive centers. That when someone takes time to exercise that starts to become self-evident. You naturally start to see the moment more clearly because you're working with the filter of, am I projecting myself or am I observing myself? And so I see that learning how to do that as well is important moving forward with psychedelic therapies, because we know the power of a mystical experience, which is really truly surrendering yourself to something, requires the ability to surrender. And if you can't surrender, then you end up with a very fragmented or confusing experience. So in many ways, getting people to remember themselves prepares them for a moment of ultimate memory, which then helps them integrate more easily, and then helping them use different neurofeedback protocols based on the different states that we find from psychedelics, or we find from meditation, and then also seeing what the clinical markers we see. It's like, where does somebody need the exercise to fully open or remember themselves in that moment?
So I really want to come back to the specific interplay between neurofeedback and EEG signals and psychedelic states. I think that's an absolutely fascinating one. But when I speak to, and to some degree I myself hold, the more like psychedelic purists or the contemplative purists who say that technology will never be able to elicit an experience as profound as a plant, or an experience as profound as 10 days of Vipassana meditation. What would you say to that? And this is directed to Carl and Robin. Like, what would you say to that? That the technology can't step up in the way that natural psychedelics might be able to?
I'd start by saying, I don't know whether we need to replicate excuse me, psychedelics. You know, but then on the other hand, you know, if I think about my most profound experiences with VR, I mean, the Marshmallow Laser Feast tree hugger experience, where I was, you know, went into a room and saw this foam structure, and then put on the headset and suddenly saw a LiDAR scanned redwood tree, ginormous redwood tree, and then realized I could put my head inside the tree, and then was seeing the water coming up through the roots. And as the water hit the base of the tree and started to go up the tree, I started to rise off the floor and had an absolutely most profound out-of-body experience. You know, I talk quite often with people about, you know, the ability with the Karolinska Institute, for instance, in Sweden, where they're creating these out-of-body experiences very easily. And you would argue that actually that's creating a faux or a phantom out-of-body experience rather than an actual out-of-body experience. But it's certainly hard to distinguish sometimes. And another experience was Isness, which is an incredible experience coming out of Bristol with David Glowacki, where you're experiencing yourself as energy or as light, and you're creating the mudra between the thumb, which is the global consciousness, and the individual finger is the personal consciousness. And when you connect the two in the VR experience, you're just seeing points of light, and it's a shared experience, and there's a physics engine inside the experience. So your other participants are actually, you're seeing them as they actually are, as light, and then you can push your light into the ground, and then suddenly the whole ground opens up. So for me, you know, these are very much powerful altered states.
And Robin, does that track with your experience, having been right at the epicenter of this movement from the very beginning?
Earl, I really appreciate the nuance of what you're saying with, I'm not sure they have to replace or they have to mimic plant-based psychedelics. As I've been working in this space for a while, this question that you ask is one that I think of often, and one that I get asked pretty often. I think, so just speaking for Sound Self, and just so people know what I'm talking about, Sound Self is a voice-driven experience. It works on a screen, it works on VR. It came out a week ago, and it uses the sound of your voice to draw you into a deep trance state. And after about 5 to 10 minutes, people stop experiencing themselves as the agent and just find themselves in a very deep state of silence and witnessing. We often see unitive states of consciousness being reported. So a major inspiration for me has been psychedelics. My creative journey and my journey into this technology was instigated by psychedelics. And I think we really are just beginning to see what's possible with these. Already seeing unitive states of consciousness, and the kinds of meaningful moments that Carl is describing, I think speaks tremendously to the potential here. But I think we gain a lot by looking at this as a different species, same category perhaps, but different species. Like, so one thing we find with sound self is that it's, okay, let's say you go on an ayahuasca journey and you take a cup of ayahuasca, there's no getting off that ride. It's taking you on that ride, and that's part of the power of that medicine, is that it can force you to look at things that you might be avoiding looking at. It can give you what you need, even if you might reject it with your mind otherwise. And I think that's why a lot of people are scared of these things, because we're afraid of losing control. What I've found with Technodelics is that you can get off the ride at any moment, which you could say that reduces, at least in the current iteration, the current form of Technodelics. You know, if you're in VR, you could take off the VR headset, but also you can just remind yourself, you know, you're in VR, or you're looking at a screen, or you're a person in a room, and this gives you a kind of way to pull back and surrender to the experience at your own pacing. So I'm thinking about Lucia number 3 as a for instance, which you might also categorize as technodelic. It's a strobe machine, or sound self. And these are both experiences that they invite a kind of surrender. But if you're not ready to deeply surrender to it, you kind of can hold yourself back, so you can measure it. And that's just maybe part of the flavor of this species of psychedelic. Somebody's asking now if you start mixing technodelics and psychedelics, and that is an interesting exploration.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks, Robin. And I just want to move back to Heather, because there was a question in the chat actually around, you know, can we, what would a neurofeedback protocol look like to induce a psychedelic experience? And so, two-part question is, A, is that possible yet to use feedback to induce psychedelic states? And B, if so, what would the protocol be?
So Jeff Tourette at the Neuromeditation Institute has successfully had people see entities and different things working with. He combined my research, which was quieting the default mode network, as well as training the medial prefrontal cortex. And there was something about combining the two. For certain individuals, they can release into a visionary state. He's also found that when done close to, or after someone's had a DMT experience, DMT experience can sometimes be reawakened. I have personally had some pretty wild experiences with neurofeedback. My first experience with this protocol, which is why I ended up doing the research, was I just stared at a screen, I watched some images, I didn't know what was going on. I went home, I was washing the EEG gel out of my hair, and I remember becoming absolutely just captivated by the shower water and the bubbles, and everything was beautiful, and I was sat down and started playing in it. And then I had a moment where I was like, I'm altered right now. I'm actually in an altered state, which is why I pursued this. On the other end, from a meditative state, it wasn't until I spoke with Shinzen yesterday that I realized I've also had an experience, I think, quite similar to what they're working on right now with ultrasound, where we see this emergent, when I was quieting the DMN and putting people into this kind of altered state. And when we did, in my research, we found that people reported very similar experiences to microdosing, like this clarity, this openness to experience, information was processing during the experience. But we would see this gamma burst in the temporal lobes. So when the decoupling happens between the hippocampus and the temporal lobes. So we decided what would happen if we rewarded that while quieting the DMN. And my supervisor had to run out while we were doing this. And then when it was done, I didn't move. And I sat there for half an hour and I had no feelings, like no experience. And we actually thought we might have lobotomized me. We didn't know what we had done. And I wasn't sure I would even be able to drive. And I managed to go home, and I again sat on the couch, and it took about 24 hours until I started feeling things again. But now I'm realizing, oh my God, that might have actually been a very similar state where it was like the ultimate apathy. So I think that, yes, you can solicit it. And it actually, by following what we're seeing in the research and then mimicking it with neurofeedback, it seems to be pretty good.
I'd like to add to what Heather is saying here, which is just, to approach this topic with doubt is, I think, very reasonable and very appropriate. But if there's one thing I can say with confidence, it's like this is a new field, and with what we are already seeing, the kind of effectiveness of these interventions is for somebody who has not experienced them firsthand, but perhaps have experienced psychedelics and might view themselves as a psychedelic purist or a plant medicine purist. I can totally understand skepticism around these interventions. I mean, you ingest, say ayahuasca, you ingest the ayahuasca and then I'm not even going to try to describe that, but that kind of transformative experience, you would be well within your rights to be deeply skeptical of electronic components as being a powerful intervention for being able to support that kind of transformation. Based on what I'm seeing so far in the very early work in this field, I think it's astounding. It's really astounding. And perhaps to help people think, like wrap their head around how that's possible, I'd like to suggest people think about transformative practices like meditation, which is a non-chemical intervention. But geez, take 20, 30 years of doing that, certain kinds of meditation for an hour or 2 hours a day, and you will experience something on par with what you might experience with a lot of ayahuasca or different. But what we can do with technology is speed up the process, the feedback loop that you have with meditation.
You're just remembering capacities you already have. We have
exactly
capacities, we just don't practice them. And so if you get a little enhanced mirroring, then you go off and do it yourself, and you
enhanced
can learn.
mirroring. That's perfect.
It's just a mirror. I hold mirrors up to people. How's this? How's this?
I'd love to weigh in on that. I think that those are both really good points. And I think the real opportunity here, when we look at sort of leadership, in this space from a thought and a execution perspective, it really does come down to the practice. And today, there's a lot of fear and apprehension as we're thinking about the positive impact that psychedelics clinically applied could have, right, in the broader set of communities. And so I think the beauty of offerings in the technodelic, digitodelic arena, and we're really proud to be pioneering one of them, is you don't have to feel like you're jumping off the deep end. And you're actually getting data and feedback. We've actually built in these loops with machine learning hooks. And so there's artificial intelligence that we're going to be able to train against this with increasing data points, which we're already approaching. And the exciting thing about that then is there's this pathway to personalization. So in a sense, like once you train the system becomes a lot more effective at being kind of your, personal, delivery mechanism. And so there is more of this symbiosis. So I just see it as a really, really powerful analog. Whether it becomes a truly distinct species, I don't know, but I'm very comfortable and confident in this being an additive analog already today. And even in the next sort of 36 months, that positive impact potential is going to be really significant.
Yeah, just to say one more thing on this, I think, it's really massive design problem. And as Mikey was saying in the previous talk, it's, to be able to design, we must understand what it means to design. And I think a lot of the times when people are making VR experiences, they don't really know what they're messing with. And you're making the entire context, you're making the environment. And we don't want to be replacing imagination with computer animation. And I think a lot of the time that's what's going on. And not only that, but You know, if you're designing an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience, be sure that you have an understanding, a multidisciplinary understanding, because you need to be acknowledging all of the aspects of your design.
Carl, you mentioned near-death experience. Have you had any experience with VR and death experiences?
Well, my co-founder Jose has created Awaken. You know, his experience is all around the near-death experience, and it's very much incredibly powerful, because you sort of leave the earth and you go. You know, you go and question everything that you're leaving behind, and you know, if you think about death as the ultimate shadow, you know, at the moment people on Facebook are posting their 20-year-old selves, and then you know, you're sort of seeing the child shadow, and then the next step up is your ancestors and the shadow of your ancestors, and the next step from there is your sexual shadow, and the final one you look at is death. So if you're, you know, I was chatting to him about this the other day, and it's like, you know, I think it's such a responsibility to be generating these experiences, and you have to really do it with a sense of total, you know, humbleness.
Yeah. Well, no, and I know our mutual friend Tamara Russell, we've spoken about this necessity for not treating these experiences as singular one-offs, like, but actually as a process. In the same way you'd integrate the psychedelic experience, it's very important that if you have an NDE in VR, that we are, from a conscious design perspective, we're taking into account the entirety of the experience, all the way from doing it to follow up later and later.
I have a metaphor for that was shared with me by another neurofeedback therapist who, you know, our default mode network is a lot our ego and our sense of self. And so we can imagine it like monkey bars. And you can imagine all your predictive models and patterns and everything else kind of like monkeys hanging on the monkey bars. So any one of these things can kind of shut the monkey bars down, and the monkeys fall off, and the monkey bars come back on, and they're clear for a bit. But if you don't deal with those monkeys, they're going to climb back up on those bars. And so we can't rely on just shaking the monkeys off the bars to be the solution. Like in normal waking consciousness, like you still have to do the work. And, you know, psychedelic therapists know this, and the same thing happens with the technodelics. And I see this clinically. I have to be very cautious of like how often I knock the monkeys off the bars, because sometimes that can be very disruptive for somebody who doesn't have a good cleanup crew.
And Heather, do you think that the technodelic space is giving sufficient importance and significance to the not shaking the monkey issue?
You know, I've mostly noticed this with some breathwork facilitation, and I've had some talks with some of the bigger ones about, you really need to be trauma informed. Like, people need to understand what's the potential of this. More or less, the way I see it is like plunging the subconscious. You're kind of like dunk, 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 and then it may not be that day. We call it blowback in neurofeedback. It's a couple days later where suddenly they have all this anxiety and depression, and they don't know why. And they need to be prepared for the fact that's because the monkeys have fallen off the bars and they're starting to want back on, and you don't want them back on. And so I don't know that framework is out there. I don't know. That's the framework I'm often trying to offer people, is understanding what happens when you state shift and what may come up for you. But I'm not certain. I haven't seen a lot of it.
I think, Heather, I think that's a great point. And I think it's incumbent upon us who are driving some of the innovation here to get more closely coupled with researchers. And so we're working with the National Mental Health Innovation Center, folks like Walter Greenleaf at Stanford, and Skip Rizzo, you know, who's kind of an expert in PTSD and human-machine interfaces. And so I think we're really in this like learning stage right now, and our kind of tenor and preference at least is to be a bit more conservative around that, because there's tremendous responsibility as you're pointing to. So, but I just see that as a huge opportunity.
Oh, I see it as a wonderful opportunity, a clinical tool. Like, I couldn't ask for something better, that people have options to be augmenting different networks in their brain between sessions so they can show up more clear, so we can work on the monkeys, right? At least I've been knocking them off. I'm not trying to knock them off all session.
Yeah.
I think that what you're pointing to, Heather, is the I mean, one of the benefits of technodelics over, say, psychedelics or uh, disciplinary meditation is the scalability of it.
Yeah.
And one of the drawbacks of the scalability is that if we're going to have that integration, and if we're going to have that, say, trauma-informed holding, that's not going to be there automatically.
Yeah. I really like, there's a model, Dr. Yellowbird, who's put forth that, and he talks a lot about neurodecolonization. And actually that a lot of what we're doing here too is actually working with so many of the colonial wounds that everybody is suffering and living with. And like, you know, our economic or global this crisis that's going on is a direct kind of result of this trajectory and everything that we just heard about. And so I'm really big on the nurturing awareness piece. And how do we see all of the technodelics and things we're doing is that we're nurturing this awareness and this connectivity that we seem to have lost, that he really speaks about in the neurodecolonization model, because we've come into this like monophasic mindset, which is very, you know, sympathetic charged, cognitive led, versus the polyphasic, which is when individuals had the capacity to transcend their states and transcend different aspects of self and with more ease, which meant they were more likely like cleaning the monkeys and cleaning their house on a regular basis, which then let them be more connected without effort. It was just a natural kind of connectivity.
I also think what's really interesting in terms of the technodelics, cyberdelics, is what they can do for the psychedelics, especially the clinical trials. I mean, I've been part of the LSD study, Imperial, and the DMT study as well. And we're planning the 5-MeO DMT study now. And for instance, I tried this crazy game, Rick's Plank experience, where you go into this hotel and you go up the lift, and then the doors open and suddenly the cityscape is in front of you, and so is a plank, and you have to walk onto the plank. And the idea is that you actually have to jump off, and your brain's going, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And the main requirement for a 5-MeO DMT experience is letting go. And you can't let go in a cognitive way. You have to have this embodied felt experience of letting go. And I thought, wow, this is actually a major preparation tool for going into some experience like a 5-MeO experience. So what can these cyberdelics, technodelics do for preparation and integration? And I noticed Rick Doblin yesterday was saying how he's very skeptical about applying this stuff because we don't want to replace the humans. Absolutely not. Especially, you know, he was saying we need tens of thousands more therapists. I totally agree with him. But when there's an open goal and you know it's not going to harm anyone, especially preparation, integration, 100% we need the therapist there.
It's just physiotherapy for the brain. We're just exercising state flexibility between the sessions. It lightens the load on the therapist. Man, my job is far easier. I work with really heavily traumatized individuals, and because I can offer them this felt sense of experience where we don't have to talk about it, that then they can work on between sessions, because I've also helped them learn a meditative state that I want them to practice, and at least gave them an anchor. And if they even had a tool to help anchor them between, then when they come back to me, now they've learned there's the flexibility then. And eventually it's like you're born back into yourself. You don't need they're just tools, right? You can't bow before it as the answer. It's a reflection. It's helping you see deeper.
I'd like to be
just once, we've got 3 minutes left, so just make it brief, Rob, and then I want to do a little
No,
closing.
it's okay.
Okay, so just curious thing, guys, just closing remarks. Could you just tell us something, if you haven't already, something particularly interesting that you've learned from your work in this space that you haven't already shared tonight? And if you keep it under 1 minute, that would be great, just to give us a little taster in terms of what we might expect over the coming months and years.
Okay, I'll start then. So I think magic is to be found in the combinations, and absolutely we need to be stacking everything, and we need to do citizen science, crowdsource all of those experiments, because you're not going to be able to do that in a clinical setting. And I think that, you know, we need to break out of the silos, not just the tech silos or the substance silos, but also out of ourselves. And if we can start sensing like a mycelium network, you know, the mushrooms survived 5 mass extinction and we're causing the 6th. So how can we learn from something much more intelligent than us? How can we sense like a forest? How can we break out of these individual points of view and start going into the periphery and growing as a result?
What comes to, go ahead. What comes to my mind is just that like placebo is remembered wellness. And I think we throw too much away when we forget what our minds are capable of on their own, and that we have tools to help us recall and to remember this. And then once we get to a place where we are fully aligned with that again, I'm just curious, like what Carl said, I think it would be like a mycelium type of connectivity that we are capable of, but we've just kind of numbed our receptors because we haven't been exercising it for so long.
Yeah, fascinating. I'll just say, I think for us and for me, it's being purpose, sort of mission driven, awe-inspired and research informed. And the thing that's blowing me away right now is in the application of an early digidelic like trip, we're seeing craving levels actually come down within a cohort of individuals who are struggling with addiction. So it just gives us a lot of confidence in the potential of this medium as an analog, as we discussed.
I'd like to take an opportunity to address some of the, a pattern I'm noticing on the chat, which is I'm noticing the words tech addiction come up and concern about this replacing something. And I'd just like to draw some attention, even for those, I mean, I'm a little bit of a Luddite for a technology developer, but I'd just like to draw some attention to our cynicism around technology. And implore you to recognize that it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, there are some technology, our current generation of technology is tragically addictive and attention grabby, and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, let's remember meditation itself is a technology. Mantras are technologies. Mandalas are technologies. I wanted to bring up a review from our Steam page just to, like, this is a video game. I'm using the video game medium and the video game distribution mechanism to get a meditation experience, a transformative meditation experience to gamers. And somebody here wrote, I have ADHD and this helped me. I usually can't do any sessions on my own downtime. The limiting factors of my brain, I've tried for years with books, gizmos, binaural beats, live sessions, can't seem to really feel anything. Meditating has sure helped my attitude and behaviors, but I never got the sense I was getting anything other than that, which is fine in itself. This game or program changed that. And I bring that up because, like, if you think that technology necessarily carries some of the, I'll just say, issues of addiction and even colonization, that's a word that keeps coming up here. It doesn't have to.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robin. I think this is really what consciousness hacking are trying to stand for, is that just because we are advocating for technology doesn't mean we are being passive as to, or accepting as to, the current ecosystem and infrastructure. Like a deep shift has to occur, but that doesn't mean we have to move away entirely. We transcend and we include. So we've got time for just a couple of questions. So guys, if you are in the Meet PS, just do us a favor and upvote or downvote so we know what questions are ranked highest and lowest. And so we'll start with the highest one, and just popcorn style. We've only got 3 more minutes. So do technodelics only focus on altered states, or can they also lead into altered traits?
So there's 3 core traits that we understand associated with a mindful presence, which I understand to be indicative of regulation of the core intrinsic networks. So you have curiosity, which is your default, that outward looking. You have the salience network, which is tied to openness, so openness to your inside and your inner world. And then you have acceptance, which is like the default mode network. And so those are the 3 traits we often will see when somebody's achieved a sense of regulation within their neural system.
Thank you.
Just
Anyone
to
else have anything to say on that,
say,
Carl?
yeah, just to say, you know, like the next experiment at Imperial is going to be DMTX, DMT extended, and you know, if we're spending all of our time, if we can actually exit 3D space and live in hyperspace, I think that's the ultimate altered trait.
I love it. I love it. You don't think like a Brit, Carl. You're an American at heart. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the next question, and maybe Robin and Moni, you can answer. How do we create more accountability in the field around safe testing and proper guidance upon facilitation of these technologies? Do you feel that psychological trauma screenings are necessary before engaging in said cyber technologies?
I mean, I'll just jump in. Look, I think the first thing is like never to make, you know, kind of claims. And so I think in general, it's incumbent upon us to be a little bit more conservative. You know, I think really diving into methodologies and being research informed puts us in a position to prevent, you know, any of that from happening. We did a bunch of extensive testing even before, you know, beta testing our consumer offering, and we've had, you know, 0 issues. So I just think, you know, a lot of that has to do with like what you're investing in terms of time and effort, and then who you're collaborating with from a methodological standpoint. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's our approach.